I'm a 45-year-old guy, living alone after a divorce. No kids, no ties, just me and my quiet little house. It's not fancy, but it's mine, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had found a little peace. I work from home, not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills, and the setup is simple enough to keep things comfortable. The neighborhood I had moved into seemed like the perfect place to settle. People were friendly. The streets were quiet, and I could finally breathe again. It had been a couple of weeks, and everything felt normal, calm, that is, until I met my new next-door neighbor. His name was Richard Peterson, but he insisted everyone call him Dick. Yeah, I know. The first time I met him, I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt, despite the fact that he looked like the type of guy who would yell at waiters for getting his order wrong, or rant about gas prices, like it was a personal offense. Our first interaction was weird. I was bringing in some groceries one afternoon when he shouted from across the yard, "You work from home, right? Must be nice doing nothing all day." I was caught off guard, but I laughed it off. I didn't have the energy to start a confrontation. But then, a couple of weeks later, I noticed something odd. One night, as I was watching TV, I got up to close the curtains. That's when I saw it, a small red light blinking across the fence line. I squinted, and it didn't take long for me to realize it was a security camera mounted on a pole in his yard, and it was aimed directly at my living room window. I stared at it for a while, hoping it was just some mistake. But no, it didn't move. It was fixed, right on my window. I figured maybe I was imagining things. So the next day I walked outside and took a photo from the sidewalk. I traced the angle of the camera, and it was clear as day. It was aimed straight into my living room, right where I usually sit. I walked over to his place to confront him. He was in his driveway, tinkering with his truck. I asked, "Hey Dick, quick thing. That new camera you put up, it's kind of pointed right at my window. Do you mind angling it away a bit?" He didn't even look up, just wiped his hands and said, "If you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind." I stood there, trying to keep my cool. I told him, "I just don't want to be watched in my own house, man. That's not okay." He looked me right in the eyes and repeated, "Then don't do anything you don't want others seeing." That's when I knew. This wasn't just some clueless guy. He knew exactly what he was doing. And at that moment, something inside me snapped. I didn't argue with him, didn't shout. I just turned around and walked back inside, furious. It wasn't about privacy anymore. It was about the arrogance, the smugness. I thought about my options, about what I could do. I looked into the local laws. Technically, what he was doing wasn't illegal. His camera was on his property, and there were no local ordinances preventing it unless he was recording audio or filming inside a bedroom or bathroom. But aiming a camera directly into someone's living room, sleazy, sure, but not illegal. Then, I had an idea. If he wanted to watch me so badly, then I'd give him something to watch. I had an old projector from work that I used for presentations. I set it up in my living room window, facing out but angled just enough to give him a perfect view. Every night, I started projecting strange, unsettling videos. Nothing illegal, of course, just bizarre stuff. Videos of me sitting motionless, staring at the camera for minutes at a time, as if I was completely losing my mind. Other nights, I'd pace the room, talking to myself in full conversations, shouting, laughing hysterically, crying, even dancing around in a bathrobe. I wore the same outfit every night, making it look like I was completely unraveling. Sometimes, I'd freeze mid-action, holding still like a statue for minutes. I never closed the blinds. The goal wasn't just to creep him out, it was to make him question his own sanity. It didn't take long for things to escalate. A week later, I noticed something odd. Richard's wife, Martha, started leaving the house by herself at first. It was just for short walks with the dog, but soon, it was longer trips. One night, I saw her loading suitcases into her car, and the next morning, she was gone. No note, no goodbye. And then, Richard came pounding on my door. He was furious. His face was red, and he was out of breath. "You sick bastard," he shouted. I didn't flinch. I didn't shout back. I just calmly held up a piece of paper, a legal document, a cease and desist letter I had drawn up with the help of a lawyer friend. It stated that if his camera wasn't removed within 48 hours, I'd file for harassment. And I had time-stamped footage showing it aimed right into my living room. He stared at the paper like it was a weapon. He didn't even take it. He just stormed off, red-faced, muttering under his breath. I thought that was the end of it, but it wasn't. That same night, the music started. Loud music, old rock, whatever he could find. He cranked it up at 2:00 a.m., blasting it through my walls. I called the cops. They came, gave him a warning, but the next day, he had 4 more cameras installed, one pointing at my driveway, one at my front door, one at the side of the house, and, of course, one still aimed directly at my living room. It was like he was daring me to react. But this time, I wasn't just going to sit back and let him do whatever he wanted. I started documenting everything. I installed my own cameras, a full perimeter setup, capturing every angle of his behavior. I recorded the noise levels, kept logs of everything, and saved every video, every audio clip. I even kept track of every visit from the police. And then the rumors started. One neighbor stopped waving at me. Another started crossing the street when walking his dog. I found out later that Richard had been telling people I was a predator, that I'd been acting out in front of his cameras, that I had frightened his wife. But I was ready. I printed up flyers for every house on the block. I included screenshots from my footage, showing his camera setup, the noise harassment, and a brief explanation of what really happened. I wasn't trying to look like a victim. I just told the truth. And that's when things really started to heat up. But I wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything. Things were getting out of hand. Richard's behavior had gone from creepy to downright malicious, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. But as the days passed, it became clear that this wasn't just some petty neighborly squabble. This was personal, and Richard was only getting more desperate. Once I sent out those flyers, things in the neighborhood started to shift. People who had once been friendly began avoiding me. It wasn't just that they weren't saying hello anymore. They were crossing the street to avoid walking by my house. I heard whispers as I passed by. Some people looking at me with suspicion in their eyes, as if they had believed his lies. It was frustrating, but I knew what I was doing was right. Richard had set this whole thing in motion, and I was just defending myself. Then came the first big shift. I filed the lawsuit. I wasn't just playing around anymore. I had gathered enough evidence, video footage, audio clips, decibel readings, a logbook tracking his harassment, everything. I hired a lawyer and went all in. I filed for harassment, defamation, and emotional distress. This wasn't about just stopping him. It was about making sure he paid for what he had done. Richard, of course, tried to laugh it off. He claimed I was insane, that I was performing for his cameras, begging for attention. But the judge didn't buy his story. That was a huge win for me. But it wasn't the end of Richard's antics. Far from it. That night, as if on cue, the music started again. But this time, it wasn't just any music. It was blaring rock from the 70s, loud enough that I could feel the bass reverberating through my walls. And it didn't stop at 10:00 p.m. or even midnight. No. It went on until 2:00 a.m. He was making a statement, but I wasn't going to let it break me. I called the cops, again, and they came by, giving him a warning. The very next day, he retaliated in the worst possible way. 4 more cameras went up on his property. One aimed directly at my front door, one at my driveway, one at the side of my house, and, of course, the one still aimed at my living room window. It was as though he was daring me to make a move, to do something that would give him a reason to escalate further. But I wasn't backing down. That's when I decided to install my own security system. I wasn't going to let him control my life. Not anymore. I set up cameras around my house, a complete perimeter, covering every angle of his behavior. I wanted every piece of evidence, just in case he tried anything else. I also started recording the noise levels of his late-night rock music, capturing every decibel with precision. I kept everything, every video, every audio clip. every police visit. But even with all the documentation, the worst part came when the rumors started. I heard whispers from other neighbors, people who had always been friendly, now turning their backs on me. One neighbor, a woman I had always spoken to in passing, stopped waving entirely. Another neighbor began crossing the street when walking his dog to avoid passing by my house. I was getting the sense that Richard was painting a very different picture of me to the rest of the block. I found out that he had been telling people I was a predator, he claimed, that I had been acting out in front of his cameras, frightening his wife, and generally being a weirdo. That was the last straw. I had to do something. I printed up flyers, one for each house on the block. They included screenshots from my footage, showing his camera setup, proof of the music harassment, and a brief but clear explanation of what had actually happened. I wasn't trying to garner sympathy or play the victim. I simply wanted people to know the truth. And it worked. People started talking. The whispers I had been hearing turned into conversations, and the neighbors who had been avoiding me began to ask questions. They wanted to know what was going on, and they wanted to hear my side of the story. It was like a domino effect, and I could feel the tide turning in my favor. But just as things seemed to calm down, I took the next step. I filed the lawsuit. I wasn't playing anymore. I had the documentation. I had the evidence, and I was going to make sure Richard faced the consequences for his actions. And that's when the real war began. One day, out of nowhere, I got a knock on my door. It wasn't Richard this time. Instead, it was a woman, a tired-looking woman in her 50s. She had a quiet voice and seemed almost defeated. She introduced herself as Gina, Martha's sister. Gina told me something that sent a chill down my spine. She said that Richard wasn't as clean as he appeared. Apparently, he had done this exact same thing before to a woman in Oregon, a neighbor who had rejected his advances. He had harassed her for months, installed cameras, spread rumors, and even poisoned her dog. The woman had eventually moved across the state to escape him. She never pressed charges because she was too scared. But that wasn't the worst part. Gina said that Martha didn't know the full story, not until recently. When Richard started setting up his cameras again, that was when she found out everything. And it had been the tipping point. She had confronted Richard, and he denied everything, but it didn't matter. She left him. And that's when she finally knew who her husband really was. Gina also told me something else that made my blood run cold. Richard kept journals, not just random notes, but full notebooks detailing his obsession with people. He tracked their movements, noted when they left the house, who visited, and what they wore. And now he had been doing the same thing with me. I asked her where the journals were. She hesitated, then said that Richard kept them locked away in a cabinet in the garage. I asked if she could get one. She nodded. And 2 nights later, she came back with a thick, red notebook in her hand. Inside were pages upon pages of notes about me. Everything. Dates, times, and detailed paragraphs about what I was doing. Watched him eat at 7. 13 p.m. ate slowly. Maybe depressed. Sat naked on the couch again. Exhibitionist. No blinds equals invitation. Walked around with what looked like a weapon, possibly a cane. It went on for 40 pages. 40 pages of meticulous notes about me. That was the last piece I needed. And then, it escalated even further. It was hard to believe what I was reading. 40 pages of detailed notes about me, all meticulously tracked and recorded by Richard in his twisted little journal. It was more than creepy. It was outright terrifying. I had been dealing with his obsession for months, but seeing it all laid out in writing like that made it real in a way I hadn't fully understood before. This wasn't some neighbor being weird. This was a man consumed by something far darker. I didn't even hesitate. I immediately handed the journal to my lawyer, who was already in the process of compiling my case against Richard. This was the kind of evidence we needed to bury him. I was done with playing nice. This had gone too far. Richard wasn't just some nuisance anymore. He was a threat. But I didn't know how much worse things were about to get. 2 days before our second court hearing, I was sitting in my living room when I heard a loud crash outside. My stomach dropped. I knew something was wrong. I ran to the window, and my heart sank. My entire house had been egged. The front, the sides, The car in the driveway, everything. It was as though someone had taken their time to make sure it wasn't just a few eggs thrown in a rush. No, this was deliberate. And it wasn't kids, it was targeted. They even went so far as to shove a raw chicken under the front door handle. I stared at it, horrified. I immediately called the police again, and they came out to file a report, but as expected, there wasn't much they could do. There were no cameras from his property pointing directly at the act. And funny enough, Richard's cameras, which were trained on every inch of my property, had somehow failed to capture the egging. I checked mine, and it didn't take long to realize someone had gone to the trouble of spraying black paint over the lenses. My cameras were disabled. That wasn't enough to stop me, though. I wasn't going to let him win. I replaced my cameras the next day, this time with weatherproof, hidden ones tucked under the roof eaves. Out of his line of sight, I made sure he couldn't see them from his yard. It was time for me to take back control, and I wasn't about to let Richard destroy my life. But Richard's campaign against me didn't stop there. A few days later, I received a call from my HOA, the Homeowners Association. Apparently, someone had filed multiple complaints against me. Things like improper trash storage, suspicious behavior, excessive noise, and even one about possible drug activity. All of it was false. All of it was fabricated. I knew exactly who had filed those complaints, Richard. He was trying to turn the whole neighborhood against me. I had to show up at an HOA meeting, where I was essentially put on trial. Thankfully, I had already done my part, spreading the truth through flyers, and a few of my neighbors came to my defense. One even stood up and said, "We all know what Dick's been doing. Let's not pretend we don't." That statement silenced everyone, and the complaints were dismissed. But it was exhausting. Every day, I felt like I was defending my right to exist, just because I had asked a neighbor to stop watching me. The worst part came when I discovered that Richard had gone even further than I had imagined. One morning, I couldn't find my cat, Luna. She's an indoor cat, old and shy, and she's always been close to me. I searched everywhere, called her for hours, and put up missing pet signs. I walked the neighborhood, asked neighbors if they had seen her. Nothing. 3 days later, I found her, but it wasn't like I expected. Luna wasn't alive. She had been placed in a cardboard box and left under the hedge near my backyard gate. No marks, no wounds, but something felt deeply wrong. The box smelled of engine oil and rotten meat. I was sick. I couldn't breathe. I felt like my entire world had collapsed in on me. I couldn't prove it was Richard who had done it. But I knew, and it broke me in a way I didn't think was possible. Luna had been there, through my divorce, through all my lonely years. She had been my constant companion, and now she was gone. Not by accident, but to send me a message. I buried her that night in the garden, right under the window where Richard had first pointed his camera. I stood there for a long time, just staring into the lens of his camera, flashlight in hand. I didn't say a word. I just stood there for 5 minutes, letting him watch me grieve, letting him see the full weight of what he had done. Then, I turned and went inside. I called my lawyer and told him, "Let's go nuclear." We started digging. We uncovered more than we expected. Turns out, Richard had a history. My lawyer found 3 previous complaints against him in other neighborhoods before he moved here. 2 of them were civil suits, both settled out of court: harassment, destruction of property. It seemed Richard had a pattern. He'd been doing this kind of thing for years, ruining people's lives for no reason other than his own twisted need for control. Then came the real bombshell. The day before our second court hearing, I got a knock at the door, but it wasn't Richard. This time, it was a woman, someone I didn't recognize. She was in her 50s. With a worn-down face and a quiet voice, she introduced herself as Gina, Martha's sister. And she told me something that made my blood run cold. "This isn't the first time he's done this," she said. "Back in Oregon, he did almost the exact same thing to a neighbor, a woman who rejected his advances. He harassed her for months. Cameras, rumors, loud music, everything. He even poisoned her dog. The woman moved across the state to escape him. She never pressed charges. She was too scared." I was stunned. I could barely process the words. But it wasn't over, Gina went on. Martha never knew the full story until recently, when Richard started saying that the new neighbor gave him a weird vibe. That's when Martha found out everything. She confronted him, but he denied it. And that's when she left him. That's when she realized who he really was. And then came the most chilling part. He keeps journals, Gina said. Notebooks, pages and pages about people, what they do, who visits, what time they leave, what they wear. He's been doing it for years. I couldn't breathe. I asked her where the journals were, and she told me that Richard kept them locked in a cabinet in his garage. A few days later, Gina came back to me, holding a thick red notebook. She handed it to me. Inside were detailed accounts of my every move, notes on what I was doing, what I was wearing, and where I was going. Sat naked on the couch again. Exhibitionist. No blinds equals invitation. I felt like I was going to throw up, but that was just the beginning. Richard wasn't finished. And now, I wasn't going to just survive. I was going to make sure he paid for everything he had done. I had enough evidence to bury him, and I wasn't going to stop until he was held accountable. It was time for the confrontation. The pieces were finally coming together. Everything Richard had done, all his obsessive behaviors, the harassment, the lies, the manipulation, it was all being exposed. And I was ready to make sure he faced the consequences for it. But as it turned out, Richard still had a few tricks left up his sleeve. The day before our second court hearing, I received a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and when I opened it, my heart dropped. It wasn't Richard standing there this time. It was a woman older, in her 50s, her voice low and weary. She introduced herself as Gina, Martha's sister. At first, I was confused. I had only heard about Martha in passing and had no real idea who Gina was, but when she told me what she knew about Richard, everything fell into place. This isn't the first time he's done this, she said quietly, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Back in Oregon, Richard did almost the exact same thing to a neighbor, a woman who rejected his advances. He harassed her for months, set up cameras, spread rumors, blasted music at all hours. He even poisoned her dog. She moved across the state to escape him. Never pressed charges, though. She was too scared. I stood there in stunned silence. This was it, the confirmation I had been hoping for. It wasn't just me. He had a history, and it was the same sick pattern of behavior, Gina continued, telling me how Martha didn't know the full story until recently. When Richard started claiming that the new neighbor gave him a weird vibe, Martha confronted him. He denied everything, of course, but it didn't matter. That's when she finally realized the depth of his obsession, and it was then that she left him. But the most terrifying part, Gina told me that Richard had kept journals. Pages upon pages detailing his interactions with people in the neighborhood. He tracked their comings and goings, what they wore, when they left the house, who visited everything. I was horrified. Where are these journals now? I asked, already knowing the answer. Gina hesitated before speaking. He keeps them locked in a cabinet in his garage. 2 nights later, she came back to me, holding a thick red notebook. She handed it over, and I opened it with trembling hands. Inside were pages and pages of meticulous notes about me, times, dates, observations, and the things I had done. Watched him eat at 7:13 p.m., ate slowly, maybe depressed, sat naked on the couch again, exhibitionist. No blinds equals invitation. It was terrifying to see how far he had gone, how closely he had been watching me. It was like something out of a horror movie, but this was real. This was my life. But even after all that, Richard didn't stop. The next escalation was even more dangerous. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a noise outside. I went to the window and froze. There was movement in Richard's yard, 2 figures, digging near the side of his house. Behind the shed, the floodlight in his backyard clicked on, and I could see them clearly now. One of the figures was Richard, the other, a younger guy, wearing a black hoodie and gloves. They were digging, not a hole, but something long and wrapped in a tarp. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my phone and started recording, but the camera wasn't clear enough to capture exactly what they were burying. The shape was long, maybe 4 feet, and they covered it quickly, looking around nervously before disappearing back inside. I didn't waste a second. I called Detective Kravitz, explaining everything. She didn't hesitate for a second. By 4:00 p.m. the next day, the police had a search warrant and were digging up Richard's backyard. What they found was chilling: a rifle, plastic bags filled with disguises, black clothes, wigs, dot rope, dot zip ties, duct tape, and a burner phone. The contents of that phone would turn out to be the key to everything. But before we could even process what had happened, the police had already begun tracing the phone, digging deeper into Richard's past. But the real twist came after that discovery. The morning after the police uncovered the buried items, I got a call. It was Detective Kravitz. "You need to come down to the station," she said, her voice grim. I didn't ask questions. I just grabbed my keys and headed down there. When I arrived, she led me into a small interview room and slid a folder toward me. "Read these texts," she said, her voice low. I opened the folder and froze. Inside were printed logs from the burner phone Richard had buried. Dozens of texts exchanged between Richard and someone named D. Palmer. I didn't recognize the name, but the messages made my stomach churn. "Going to take care of it next week. He walks every morning at 7. Got the tool. Just need the window." The messages continued, and I felt my blood run cold. "If I do this, I need your word no more debts." Kravitz looked me dead in the eye. "He was planning to kill you." I couldn't speak. My mind was racing, but I couldn't make sense of it. I couldn't breathe. The reality of what Richard had been planning hit me like a punch to the gut. Detective Kravitz continued. "We traced the phone number. D. Palmer is an ex-military man, dishonorably discharged, known for handling problems. Richard was trying to hire him to kill you." I sat there in shock as she explained the charges they were preparing to bring against Richard: conspiracy to commit murder, harassment, trespassing, destruction of property, animal cruelty. The list went on and on. But the worst part, they needed me to be there for the confrontation, not for the arrest, but for Richard to see me when they took him down. They wanted him to know that his plans had been exposed. That night, just after sunset, the police showed up at Richard's door. He answered, wearing a robe and slippers, looking calm. But when he saw me standing on the sidewalk, flanked by 2 officers, his face changed. I saw it: the panic, the realization that his whole world was about to come crashing down. Then, without warning, he sneered at me. "You think you've won. This is nothing. You think the court's going to fix you." Detective Kravitz stepped forward, her voice firm. "Richard Peterson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and multiple related charges. You have the right to remain silent." Richard didn't stay silent. He screamed at the top of his lungs, ranting about how he was only trying to protect me, how I was the pervert, how I was the one invading his privacy. The neighbors began to gather, phones out, recording. Martha arrived 5 minutes later. She didn't say a word as she walked up to him, slapped him so hard that the sound echoed in the street. "You killed my marriage," she said, her voice shaking. "You killed my sister's peace. You killed that man's cat. You're not sick, Richard. You're evil." He tried to lunge at her, but the officers were quick, hauling him into the squad car. The whole street stood in silence as the car drove away, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of relief. After that night, everything changed. It wasn't immediate. I was still jumpy, still checking every shadow, still double-locking my doors. But slowly, life began to return to normal. The neighbors who had avoided me started coming over, offering apologies, food, even hugs. Some of them left handwritten notes. One teenager even dropped a card in my mailbox that simply said, "Thanks for standing up." I was granted the restraining order, but honestly, it didn't matter anymore. Dick was facing serious charges, and he was denied bail. He pled guilty to several charges to avoid trial, and the court even read his journals aloud. Pages of obsession, hate, paranoia. It was his own words that buried him. "I'm still healing. It's not easy, and I don't trust as easily as I used to. I check every shadow, every sound. But there's one thing I know for sure. Silence isn't safety. Standing up is. even if it nearly destroys you. Richard Peterson was sentenced to 18 years without parole. And while that brings me some sense of closure, I'll never forget what it took to get here. I finally replaced the living room window, the one that started it all. I put up new blinds that close at the push of a button. The cameras are still there, though. They're a reminder of how far I had to go to protect myself. And sometimes, when I sit in the same spot, on the same couch, I look out the window. It's quiet now, just the sound of wind in the trees, the hum of distant cars. But I can't help wondering, what would have happened if I hadn't stood my ground? If I had ignored that first red light blinking in the dark? I didn't ignore it. I pushed back. And I survived. Richard Peterson is gone, but his shadow still lingers in the corners of my mind. I'm still here,